Welcome to the third dimension. A horrific 8-year-old conflict has ravaged Yemen since the Houthi militia attacked the country's state institution in Sana'a 2014, triggering one of the worst humanitarian crises in the world. During 2020, several rounds of negotiations between Yemeni government and the Houthis, which were held under the auspices of the United Nations, brought a fragile ceasefire for several months. Now, with the opening of the new year, Houthis seem to be gearing up for a new waves of conflict in 2023 amid lack of decisive steps towards sustainable peace, adding to the suffering of millions of people living in the war-ravaged country. To impact this topic, joining me from Washington, D.C., Fatima Al-Asrar. Fatima is a senior scholar at Middle East Institute and she is an established author on Yemen. Welcome to the third dimension, Fatima, and Happy New Year.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Happy New Year, and thanks, Dr. Hassan, for having me.
Thank you. If we may start, just if you could give us your impression about the wide political landscape of the Yemeni situation now. Yeah, what is your take on this? How do you comment on it?
It's a very broad question, so I'm going to try my best to answer it within the context of the truce. Yemen's current situation is really extremely fragile, and it's largely influenced by the geopolitical events in the region and the actions and decisions of external actors, including Saudi Arabia, Iran, and the United Nations as well. The temporary ceasefire, or the truce that has began in April 2nd, we know that it failed to renew. It renewed for 3 times, and then it failed to renew on October 2nd. And the reason for that was the reluctance of the Houthi militia to go on and fully endorse this truce. They have asked for really maximalist conditions and requirements that were beyond the government's capacity to implement, but they also did not hold their part of the bargain from either, lifting the siege on Taiz was an issue that was contentious. They refused to do any movement on it, and it just became really a truce that has almost benefited the Houthis to little benefit to the majority of areas in Yemen. So the United Nations is trying truly hard to get these negotiations going, but as we can see from the Houthi media and their increasing demands, they're asking for things like paying salaries for civil servant employees since 2014. These things are not really helpful because, some of these salaries actually include Houthi loyalists and Houthi militia members. But also it's a way for the Houthis to avoid their responsibilities from serving people and trying to get as much as possible from the international community to sort of like lift the pressure off them from providing economically to the people that they govern, while they focus their entire attention towards reinforcing their military capabilities and increasing recruitment. As we saw during the truce, the Houthis have upped from their military displays, doing huge military displays and parades in Hodeidah, in Sana'a, and other cities, and trying to really focus on this aspect. But also, they've conducted drone strikes on areas in the south and on oil port terminals, with the sole focus of trying to pressure Yemen's government from exporting oil overseas, because they feel that they're entitled to that oil that's coming out of Yemen territory, although it's territory that they're not entitled to and they can't govern. So as you can see, there are so many things that are happening locally that are unfortunately very difficult to deal with. It's very difficult for the United Nations, for the Yemen's government to deal with, and especially in this environment where the Houthis are able to get away with all of these drone attacks without they are being condemned, but there isn't really any type of action that would hold them and restrict them from doing these types of attacks in the future. So the situation remains really precarious, extremely delicate, and more policymakers are really trying to solve the problem, but with so many things happening in the world, the fate of Yemen really hangs in the balance at the moment of what the local political parties also decide to do.
Okay, so despite what you've said, if I may take you to the U.S. Special Envoy Tim Linderkin's latest briefing, he said, despite a failure to extend that ceasefire, efforts to achieve lasting peace are in a new phase. In your opinion, what is the new phase Mr. Linderkin is talking about?
I would say, I would speculate at this point because, we've heard such optimistic statements in the past that went nowhere. Statements like it's impossible for the Houthis not to extend because it wouldn't be in their best interest to do so. And of course, they haven't extended. So I think it's a very hopeful message to the new year because there isn't really anything to give. My only concern is the possibility of rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and the Houthis. And, while on the outset, this might sound like a good step that both of them would come to an agreement. But my real concern is how does Houthis reconcile with the different political parties in Yemen? Houthis' political ideology does not allow them to power there. It's really antithesis to everything that they have been preaching for the past 8 years. So my question here is that if Saudi Arabia and the Houthis come to an agreement, how would that impact Yemen society in all of its different components? How will it impact the political parties? So we sort of have to, and I think this is probably a blind spot for the U.S. administration. We remember when Biden said that he wanted to end the war when he assumed office in Yemen, but he realized that this is not as easy as it sounds. It's not enough to pressure Saudi Arabia to end the war.
Yeah, perhaps. Perhaps the part of the American administration will come later to cover it, Fatima. But if you are talking now about the Saudi Houthi direct talks, okay, and perhaps it would be a good idea to bring that. Now, reports say that the recent Omani delegation visit to Sana'a was in that context, okay? They were in fact transmitting what we call Saudi proposals. This time they talk about written Saudi proposals to the Houthis and vice versa. In this context, don't you think that this kind of direct talk between the Houthis and the Saudis in a way undermines the legitimate government?
It's a good question. I think that Saudi has not issues that are related to its national security that might have to, as a government, Saudi Arabia might have to consider its interest prior to our interests, because we have also in Yemen failed to make any impact or any waves on this war. So Saudi, at the very beginning of the conflict, has managed to secure some cities, have managed to secure Maghreb, has managed to secure the south and push the Houthi influence from it. But since then, it has been under increased pressure from the international community to end its role. It's under increased pressure from the United States to end its role. And that type of focus comes at also increasing critique from Yemeni communities, from Yemeni political parties to the conduct of Saudi Arabia. So I wouldn't be surprised if Saudi wants to wash its hands of Yemen. I wouldn't be surprised at all. Yemenis haven't even made up their mind whether they really want Saudi Arabia to intervene or not. So if you think about it, the majority of political parties have been critical of the Saudi role, have been critical of the Yemen Presidential Council. And at the same time, they're terrified of Saudi Arabia leaving, because that means that the Houthis will not be limited in any way. They will have unbridled power. So, there needs to be some type of a unity and a vision from the Yemeni community, from the Yemen Presidential Council, in terms of what the next steps might be. And that has also to be in unity with Saudi Arabia. To your question, does that undermine the legitimate government of Yemen? I think the Presidential Council, it's in its best interest to reach an agreement with the Houthis. However, the problem is that the Houthis will never agree to any agreement with the Council, and it's very unlikely that they agree to anything with the Saudis at the moment, given the very volatile situation in Iran. So Houthis have been used as a pawn for the Islamic Republic of Iran for the longest time. And I think the Islamic Republic will continue applying pressure through the Houthis. Yeah. So I think that the prospects of, this going away soon, and the hopes that, or maybe the prospects of the Saudi Houthi rapprochement might be a little bit exaggerated.
Okay, so if I may take your last remark about Iran's role in this conflict, and now as an author who has published lots of pieces on Iran and Iran's proxy, Iran's policy in the Middle East, now how do you see, or how can we assess Iran's intervention in Yemen, and how would that affect the Yemeni crisis, especially in terms of the populist uprising now in Iran against the regime?
So, Iran's support for the Houthi rebels has complicated the issue in Yemen. It has complicated the crisis and also the efforts to resolve the crisis in Yemen. So it has given the Houthis great ability to resist attempts by the government or by the United Nations to really put their weapons down and come to peace, as we have seen in the failed truce, as we have seen in attacks that the Houthis conducted on Saudi Arabia, UAE last year. So it fueled the regional conflict between Iran and Saudi Arabia to the benefit of Iran. So with the current volatile situation in Iran, I think it would be, I wouldn't think that it would be in the best interest of the Islamic regime to actually see the Houthis and Saudi Arabia reach an agreement, because the Houthis have always been used as a pressure card on the region. And if that agreement happens, and it kind of like would be hard to take it back in case Iran or the Houthis want to escalate. So I think, just watching what's happening in Iran, watching the amount of pressure that the Islamic regime is under, makes it probably more prone to having some sort of backroom deals with Saudi Arabia, not necessarily via the Houthis. The Houthis will always be a card that will be used to pressure Saudi Arabia. And I think it's really fundamental to understand that, because that has been the cause for repetitive failures of these talks throughout the past 8 years.
Okay. So, Fatima, you mentioned at the start of your talk the position of the US administrations and the promises they made last year, especially in January when Biden came to the office. Okay. Why do you think this administration remains reluctant to redesignate Houthis as a terrorist group?
I think, from what we have seen this year is that, and from what we've seen since the start of the Biden administration, there has been a reversal of Trump policy. And I think we're still on that wave. We're still on the wave of, unfortunately, Yemen falling not only into geopolitical struggles, but also into U.S. domestic politics. And from what I see is that the Biden administration is taking a step back as it's reevaluating what's happening in Yemen, as it's really seeing what's happening also in the region. So initially, it did not want to designate the Houthis as a terrorist organization because it feared it would complicate the humanitarian crisis or the political crisis. But at this time, I think, the Biden administration has been keen on sanctioning individuals that have stifled the truce, that have had links with the IRGC in Iran. So things might shift. The Biden administration might designate them, and we just have to really see how things unfold this year.
Okay. So this brings me to the last point of this interview, Fatima. What are the urgent steps that you would recommend the international community to take to fix the current situation? Shortly, please.
Shortly, please.
Again, that's a very difficult question, because I think the most important thing for the international community to do is to support a political process and push for a peace process between all of the political parties. That is fundamental. And then realize that if the political process does not work, we need to think about an alternative process to pressure the Houthis, because there is willingness, as we have seen from the Yemeni government and from the Saudi government. What is lacking is willingness from the Houthi community. So a push on that direction, considering either political alternatives, is of paramount importance, because that's pretty much the only way that we can get somewhere to Yemen, and not just be trapped in a cycle of just providing humanitarian assistance and waiting for peace processes to fail. A UN Security Council resolution that was done 8 years ago needs to be reactivated. The UN needs to hold a Security Council meeting specifically to discuss alternative steps to the political process and ways where they can support Yemeni people, because otherwise the country is really fragmenting, and it's becoming a state that is unlivable for many Yemenis.
Thank you so much. This brings us to the end of this interview. Thank you very much, Fatima, for your time and expertise. And perhaps we can see you next time on Yemen Today TV. Thank you.
Inshallah. Thank you.
This brings us to the end of this interview. See you next time with a new edition of The Third Dimension. Thank you.